Good morning. I'm Marty Sawyer, and I'm the sheriff in Aiken County. Thank you for being here today, especially the citizens of Aiken that's come in. Thank you for being here. And I'm here to provide an update on the investigation that we've been investigating the death of 4-year-old Javeayah Harris. These updates never get easier to share. This past week has been heart-wrenching for everyone, but we've seen an outpouring of support in Aiken County and a massive joint law enforcement effort to search for and now to seek justice for Javeayah Harris. Personally, there's some very harsh words that I would like to use about Javeayah and Michelle and their actions. But I will not do that. And I will not do that to protect and maintain the integrity of this case. But I will tell you this. I will not refer to them as mom and dad or mother or father. They don't deserve that title. I stand before you saying this is one of the most difficult, deeply disturbing, and emotionally taxing investigations this office has ever worked, and it's weighed heavily on this sheriff's office, all these other law enforcement agencies, all these people behind me that's worked tirelessly to bring this to an end, and it's weighed heavily on our community. I am truly sickened to share what this investigation has uncovered. From the moment Javeayah was reported missing, the sheriff's office, as well as our law enforcement partners and first responders, we responded with urgency, determination, and compassion. What started as an exhaustive and complex search quickly grew to something that I would have never imagined. Now understand, I cannot discuss all the details. We should have stopped the train. Understand that I cannot discuss all the specific details in this case. But at this time, I can share that a few human remains were recovered in an area known as Cedar Creek Reservoir, also known as Stumpy Pond in Fairfield County. These remains were immediately sent to the State Law Enforcement Division, and through analysis, the DNA of the remains are consistent with being the biological offspring of Javeayah and Michelle. I want to also share with you that through forensic evidence, statements, and analysis, extensive and deliberate efforts were made to destroy and conceal evidence following Javeayah's death. Our information reveals the use of corrosive chemicals and other tools that were used to accelerate the destruction of her little body. After this was completed,
there are cases that break your heart, and then there are cases that break something deeper than that, something you didn't even know you had, until a sheriff stands in front of cameras, wearing a pink ribbon on his chest, and tells the world in a voice that keeps catching that he has been doing this job for 37 years, and he has never, in all of it, heard of anything this horrific. This is that case. A 4-year-old girl named Javeayah Harris, a reservoir in South Carolina, corrosive chemicals, and 2 people who were supposed to be the safest thing she ever knew. If you are new here, this is Crimes Records, and what we cover on this channel matters. Not for shock value, not for entertainment, but because cases like this one deserve to be told fully, carefully, and without looking away. So if this is your first time, subscribe now, because we do not skip the parts that are hard to say. We stay with them, because she deserves that much. Now let us go back to the beginning. Not to where the investigation started, but to where the story started. Because these 2 things are not the same. Javeayah Harris was 4 years old. And before she was a case number, before she was a name on a missing persons report, before a sheriff stood at a podium barely holding himself together, trying to find words for what had been done, she was a little girl. She was chatty and full of personality, the kind of child who talks to everyone and means it. She loved Minnie Mouse with the specific, unwavering devotion that only a 4-year-old is capable of. She chased chickens around the yard. She asked to stay outside until it got dark. She said yes ma'am and no sir to people she had just met. She was, by every account from the people who loved her, exactly the kind of child whose absence leaves a specific and irreplaceable shape in the world. Her favorite color was pink. That detail matters, not just as a personal fact, but because of what it became. Because in the weeks after her name went public, pink became the color of an entire community's grief. Pink billboards went up along the highways. Pink ribbons appeared on lapels. Strangers who had never been to the house on Hillsborough Street in Aiken, South Carolina, left Minnie Mouse toys and candles at the mailbox anyway. People who did not know her name 2 months ago now carry it with them the way you carry something you are not willing to put down. That is who Javeayah Harris was. That is who this case is about. And now we have to talk about what happened to her. The house on Hillsborough Street sits in Aiken, South Carolina. It is a residential address on a residential street in a city that, until this summer, most people outside South Carolina had no particular reason to know. Javeayah lived there with 2 adults, Javeayah Harris and Mishala Herring. And it is important to say clearly, from the very beginning, what Aiken County Sheriff Marty Sawyer said at a press conference that will stay with everyone who watched it. He will not refer to these 2 individuals as mother and father. He said it plainly. He said they do not deserve those titles. And this account will follow the same standard. Javeayah Harris and Mishala Herring. Those are their names. That is how they will be referred to here. Investigators believe that sometime in late May or early June, something happened in that house. They believe that whatever happened that day or that night, or whenever it occurred, resulted in the death of Javeayah Harris. She was 4 years old, and she was gone. And for approximately 1 month after that, no ambulance was called. No hospital visit was made on her behalf. No report was filed. No authority was contacted. For roughly 30 days, 2 adults in a house on Hillsborough Street went through the daily mechanics of their lives while a 4-year-old was already gone. And they said nothing. That 1-month gap is not a footnote in this case. It is the foundation of everything that followed. Because the decisions that were made during those 30 days, and in the days immediately after them, are what transformed a death into something that Sheriff Marty Sawyer, 37 years into his career, would stand at a podium and describe as the most horrific thing he had ever heard of. On the night of June 30th, a 911 call was made. A 4-year-old girl was reported missing. Law enforcement responded with urgency. The investigation began immediately. And in those first hours, those first days, every resource that could be brought to bear was moving with a single purpose: find Javeayah Harris, bring her home. What law enforcement did not know yet, what would only emerge as the investigation deepened, was that the 911 call was not what it appeared to be. Investigators would later determine that the emergency report was fabricated. It was timed, according to investigators, to a hospital visit. It was designed to redirect attention, to create the appearance of an active search for a living child, to make it look like Javeayah had gone missing in the ordinary and terrible way that children sometimes go missing, so that the search would begin pointed in the wrong direction. The fabrication itself is evidence, not just of what happened to Javeayah, but of the deliberateness with which the people responsible had decided to manage what happened afterward. This was not a panicked, impulsive act. By the time that 911 call went out on June 30th, a plan had already been in motion. But law enforcement did not know that yet. And so, the search began. The scale of what followed is difficult to fully convey. The Aiken County Sheriff's Office, led by Sheriff Marty Sawyer, mobilized with partners across local, state, and federal levels. The South Carolina Law Enforcement Division joined the effort. The South Carolina Department of Natural Resources deployed divers. The Fairfield County Sheriff's Office, under Sheriff Will Montgomery, became a critical partner as the investigation expanded its geographic reach. Hundreds of officers, boats, drones, approximately 5,000 acres of terrain searched over approximately 5 days of intensive, sustained effort. And outside the perimeter of all that official activity, something else was happening. A community was showing up. Pink billboards appeared along the highways in and around Aiken. At the mailbox on Hillsborough Street, strangers began leaving candles, Minnie Mouse stuffed animals, flowers, notes. People who had never met Javeayah Harris, who had learned her name from a news alert on their phones, were driving to a house on a street they had never been to and leaving something behind. Restaurant owners drove meals 2 hours north to feed the search crews. Community members attended every press conference, every update, every moment where there was something to witness together. This is what a community looks like when it refuses to accept that a child's disappearance is someone else's problem. And watching it happen every single day, from July 1st onward, is the only part of this story that does not leave you completely emptied out. Meanwhile, the investigation was moving, and it was moving in a direction that nobody in Aiken County had anticipated. At a press conference before the one that would change everything, Sheriff Sawyer announced that the investigation had expanded beyond Aiken County. He said it carefully. He did not say where. He did not say why. But the weight of that announcement, the way the community absorbed it and went quiet, said everything about what people feared it might mean. The search moved north, toward Fairfield County, toward a body of water known as Cedar Creek Reservoir, also called Stumpy Pond, and the DNR divers, who had already spent hours and hours searching, went into that water. And then something was found. A few human remains, recovered from Cedar Creek Reservoir in Fairfield County, South Carolina. They were sent immediately to the South Carolina Law Enforcement Division. DNA analysis was conducted, and the results were unambiguous. The remains were consistent with being the biological offspring of both Javeayah Harris and Mishala Herring. In plain language, they found her. Not all of her, not in the way anyone had hoped, not in a way that allows for a traditional burial, for a closed casket, for the specific kind of grief that requires a body to hold. But the confirmation was made. Javeayah Harris was no longer missing. She had been found in the only way that was still possible, given what had been done to her before she was put in that water. And that is the part of this case that takes it from devastating to something most people do not have a word for. Before Javeayah's remains were in Cedar Creek Reservoir, something was done to her. Sheriff Sawyer described it at the press conference, and he chose his words with a kind of precision that comes from someone who has had to figure out how to tell a community something that should not have to be told. He said that corrosive chemicals were used. He said other tools were involved. He said that extensive and deliberate efforts were made to destroy and conceal evidence following Javeayah's death. He said the process was deliberate. He said that when it was finished, what remained of a 4-year-old girl was poured into Cedar Creek Reservoir. He said, and this is his exact language, that he has never ever heard of anything so horrific. He said it once, and then he said it again. A man who has worked in law enforcement for 37 years, who has presided over some of the most difficult cases in South Carolina, who stood at that podium in a pink ribbon surrounded by dozens of his officers, also wearing pink. And he said, twice, that he had never heard of anything like this. Let that land before moving forward. Because it needs to. The question that follows is the one the transcript addresses directly, and it is the question that honest coverage of this case cannot avoid. Why go that far? If investigators already knew what happened, if both Javeayah Harris and Mishala Herring had already confessed, as the warrant documents indicate, then the act of dissolving Javeayah's remains and pouring them into a reservoir was not protecting a secret. The secret was already out, at least in the parts that mattered most. So what was this about? One answer is practical and cold. A confession can be challenged in court. It can be recanted, disputed, argued over. Physical evidence is different. Injuries can be documented. Forensic markers can be analyzed. A cause of death determination can be made by a coroner and placed before a jury. Physical evidence, the kind that exists on a body, is much harder to challenge than a statement made to investigators. If Javeayah was never found, or found only as dissolved fragments in a large reservoir, there would be no coroner's determination of cause. No physical proof of what the warrants allege. The confession would stand almost alone, and alone, it is more vulnerable. Destroying what remained of Javeayah was, in this reading, an attempt to destroy the evidentiary foundation of the case against them. It was an attempt to make sure that even if they were caught, there would be nothing left to confirm the story beyond their own words. That calculation failed. Partially. Some remains survived. DNA was confirmed, and what they did after Javeayah was gone is now its own charge. The other answer is darker and more uncomfortable, and this case forces you to look at it directly. Sometimes what people do after a child is harmed tells you something about how they understood that child in the first place. The level of deliberateness involved here, chemicals, tools, a process that takes time, that requires looking at what you've done and deciding to continue, that ends with pouring what is left of a 4-year-old into a lake. That is not a panicked act. It is a methodical one. It requires planning. It requires a sustained decision across time. Whatever state of mind produces that kind of decision is one that most people will spend their entire lives never coming close to. Both of those answers can be true at the same time, and neither of them is any comfort at all. Before going further into the legal reality of what both individuals now face, it is worth taking a moment to sit with the harder question that this case raises. Because this is the question most true crime coverage skips, and it is the one that makes cases like this one matter beyond their specifics. People want to know what kind of person does something like this to a child. The instinct is to look for something in the background, something broken, something documentable, a paper trail of warning signs that nobody connected in time. And sometimes that trail exists. Sometimes there is a history of cruelty that should have been caught years earlier, but sometimes there is not. Sometimes two people who appear entirely ordinary, who go to work and pay bills and talk to their neighbors, make a sequence of decisions that ends in something like this. And the absence of an obvious explanation is somehow more disturbing than if one had existed. Because if there is no clear category to place this in, then the horror is not safely contained somewhere far away from the ordinary world. It just sits there, open. What researchers who study these cases do know is this. The majority of child homicides in the United States are committed not by strangers, not by the unknown figure lurking at the edge of an emergency call, but by a parent or guardian. The people the child trusted most, the people the child was entirely dependent on. That is not a comfortable statistic. It is not the version of the world most people want to live in. But it is the version that keeps being confirmed, case after case, year after year. According to data from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, more than 1,500 children in the United States lose their lives at the hands of a parent or caregiver every single year. That number represents confirmed cases, the ones where cause and manner were established through thorough investigation. Researchers estimate the true figure is higher, because some of these cases are categorized as accidents or sudden illness, particularly in very young children, where the signs of harm can be difficult to distinguish from natural causes without rigorous examination. In South Carolina specifically, child fatalities linked to caregiver-related circumstances have been a sustained concern for child welfare advocates. The state has historically ranked near the top of national figures for child poverty, a factor that research consistently links to elevated stress in caregiving environments. That context does not explain what happened to Javeayah Harris. It does not excuse it. But it situates this case inside a broader reality that extends far beyond one house, on one street, in one city in South Carolina. The specific combination of elements in this case, an injury or event that went unaddressed for weeks, a cover-up maintained by two adults simultaneously, a fabricated emergency call timed to redirect a search, and a method of disposal that reflects significant planning, points towards something that psychologists who study family violence describe as a crisis of exposure. The harm had already happened. The window for telling the truth had long since closed. Every decision made after that first failure to seek help was driven not by a calculated hatred of Javeayah specifically, but by a mounting terror of being found out. That terror, compounding over weeks, can produce decisions that look incomprehensible from the outside but follow a terrible internal logic. The further you have gone, the further you have to go to cover it. None of that is an excuse. It is not a defense. It is simply the closest thing to an answer that the available research can offer. And it still does not fully explain the reservoir. What the sheriff's words at that podium capture better than any analysis can is something simpler and harder than all of it. In those final weeks, Javeayah was seen not as a child who deserved to be saved, but as a problem to be contained. That is the most honest answer to the question of why. And it is the most unbearable one. If you have been watching this, and this case has stayed with you the way it has stayed with everyone who has followed it closely, this is a good moment to make sure you do not miss what comes next. Subscribe to Crimes Records if you have not already, and like this video. These cases take extensive research, and your support is what makes it possible to keep covering them with the depth and care they deserve. Now back to the case, because the legal chapter of this story is one that every person following it needs to understand clearly. As of the press conference where Sheriff Sawyer confirmed the recovery of remains and the additional charges, both Javeayah Harris and Javeayah Harris are in custody at the Aiken County Detention Center. Both were denied bond from the beginning. Neither is going anywhere while the legal process moves forward. Before the press conference, both were already facing the primary charge in this case. Under South Carolina Code Section 16-385, homicide by child abuse, the law applies when a person causes the death of a child while committing acts constituting an extreme indifference to human life. Javeayah was 4 years old. She fell within the protected age range under both the previous and updated versions of this statute. The charges carry different weight depending on the specific provision under which each person is charged. According to the warrant information, Javeayah Harris is charged under the direct cause provision of the statute. That provision carries a minimum sentence of 20 years and a maximum sentence of life imprisonment. Javeayah Harris is charged under the aiding and enabling provision, which applies to a person who knowingly allowed the situation to occur without being the direct physical cause. That provision carries a range of 10 to 20 years. Both provisions are severe. The distinction matters legally because it affects the ceiling of each person's exposure. And then there is the question of parole. Under South Carolina law, a life sentence imposed under this charge is not eligible for parole. There are no work credits that reduce it, no education credits, no good conduct reductions, no early release programs of any kind. If a judge imposes a life sentence, that is the sentence. It does not move. The ceiling in this case is, as the transcript puts it, a room with no door out. On the day of the press conference, new charges were added. Both Javeayah Harris and Javeayah Harris now face a charge of destruction and desecration of human remains under South Carolina Code Section 16-17-6. That charge carries a penalty of 1 to 10 years imprisonment and a fine of up to $5,000. It runs alongside the primary charge, not instead of it. And in South Carolina, judges have the ability to run sentences consecutively, meaning one after the other rather than at the same time. If that happens, the desecration charge adds years on top of whatever the primary charge produces. Javeayah Harris additionally faces a charge of filing a false police report, which carries up to 5 years or a $5,000 fine. That charge connects directly to the fabricated 911 call on June 30th, the one that sent hundreds of officers and an entire community in the wrong direction while the truth sat 30 days old and deliberate in a house on Hillsborough Street. Stacking all of this together, if both individuals are convicted on all charges and sentenced to maximum consecutive terms, the potential exposure is a life sentence plus additional years from the remaining charges. Practically speaking, a life sentence makes the additional terms symbolic in terms of time served. But they matter for what the legal record officially says about what was done. They matter for what the system is willing to put on paper. There is one more element of the South Carolina sentencing framework worth knowing, because it speaks directly to the kind of defense arguments that sometimes emerge in cases involving very young children. The statute explicitly states that a child's crying cannot be treated as provocation or as a mitigating circumstance when determining sentence. That provision is written into the law because it has been raised as a defense in cases like this before. It has been anticipated. It has been closed. A judge in this case cannot legally reduce a sentence on the basis that the child was difficult or distressing to manage. On the other hand, the aggravating circumstances in this case are exactly what a judge is required to consider in determining where within the statutory range to sentence. The deliberate concealment, the chemical destruction of remains, the fabricated search, the month of silence. Every one of those decisions is a factor that the law expects to push the sentence toward the higher end of the range. Whether a jury ultimately convicts, and on which specific charges, remains to be determined. The next scheduled court appearance is September 18th. That date is not a trial. It is a status hearing. The first formal courtroom proceeding where attorneys will be present, where bond arguments may be revisited by a circuit court, judge, and where the case begins its official legal journey. A trial of this complexity, with multiple charges, forensic evidence still being processed, and confessions that will require corroboration, realistically takes a year or more to reach. The community waiting for a verdict will be waiting longer than September. That waiting is its own kind of wait. For Javeayah's extended family, her grandparents, her aunts, her cousins, the people who had nothing to do with any of this, and are left holding grief that has no adequate name, the September date is not closure. It is a beginning. The courtroom will eventually have something to say about what happened on Hillsborough Street. What it says will be real. It will be procedural. It will take however long it takes. And by the time a jury delivers a verdict, it will have been a very long time since that 911 call went out on the night of June 30th and the search began in earnest. The community in pink is going to have to hold on. And by every indication, they intend to. This brings us back to the press conference. Because there are things Sheriff Marty Sawyer said that morning that deserve more than a summary. They were not said by a politician performing grief for a camera. They were not part of a prepared script being read without feeling. They were said by a man who has spent nearly 4 decades watching what human beings are capable of doing to each other, who has worked through cases that would break most people. Before the second week, and who stood at that podium in a pink ribbon and made it clear that nothing, in all of those 37 years, had prepared him for this particular case. He said he was truly sickened. He said the actions were repulsive and revolting. And he said both words twice, not because he was reading from a list, but because there were no other words that fit the space. He refused to use the titles mother and father for the 2 people facing charges. He did not hedge it or soften it with qualifications. He stated it directly. They do not deserve those words. And then he moved on, because the press conference was not for them. It was for the community standing outside. It was for Javeayah's extended family watching from wherever they were. And it was for the dozens of officers in pink standing behind him, who had spent a week doing some of the most difficult work of their careers, searching a reservoir 2 hours north of Aiken for the remains of a 4-year-old girl whose favorite color matched the ribbons on their lapels. He said he had some very harsh words he would like to use about the 2 individuals responsible, and he stopped himself. Not because he lacked the vocabulary. Clearly, he did not. But because he chose to use his time and his platform on the people who deserved it. On his staff, on his law enforcement partners, on the community, on Javeayah herself. He chose to spend what time he had at that microphone, speaking about the people who showed up rather than the 2 people sitting in a detention center. That choice, what he said and what he held back, says something about the kind of law enforcement leadership that is genuinely rare. The image of that room will stay. Dozens of officers, deputies, investigators, and administrators, most of them in pink. A sheriff barely getting through his prepared remarks. A community outside that had driven out every single morning since July 1st and was going to be there the next morning too. Now, in the days that followed the press conference, the community did not step back. They stepped forward. A candlelight vigil was organized for Thursday evening at the event center on Shiloh Heights Road in Aiken, with attendees asked to bring their own candle and a planned walk to the memorial that had grown at the house on Hillsborough Street. That house, which had been a crime scene and is now just a house on a street in South Carolina, where people keep arriving in pink. A second vigil was planned for Friday at Foster Park in Union near Fairfield County, near the county where both Javeayah Harris and Javeayah Harris once lived, near the water. That held what it held for weeks before investigators arrived with boats and drones and a determination that was, watching Sheriff Sawyer that morning, obviously personal. Attendees at the Union Vigil were asked to bring a teddy bear. A bicycle giveaway for children was being organized in Augusta in Javeayah's honor later in the month. These are not the kinds of community responses that happen and then fade. They are the kind that set a tone, that signal to a child's memory that she will not be reduced to a case file while the system takes its time. The community in pink has been consistent. Every single day since July 1st, through vigils and memorials and 60 restaurant meals driven 2 hours north for search crews, the community has shown what it is willing to do for a 4-year-old it never had the chance to know. There is something worth saying here about what this case is not. It is not singular. It is not an aberration so extreme that it exists outside the range of anything that could be understood or connected to the broader world. The instinct when a case like this breaks is to treat it as incomprehensible, as the kind of thing that only happens once in a generation, to people who are categorically different from everyone else. That instinct is protective. It keeps the world feeling safer, but it is not accurate. More than 1,500 children every year in the United States. That is the confirmed count. Researchers believe the real number is higher. The cases that become public are the ones where someone looked closely enough to find the truth, where a sheriff's office had the resources, the determination, and the technology to confirm what happened. The cases where no one looked closely enough never make the news. They are listed as accidents, as sudden illness, as unexplained loss in very young children whose signs of harm, without rigorous examination, can look like something else entirely. That means the number is almost certainly an undercount. It means that for every case that reaches a press conference, that reaches a community in pink, that reaches a sheriff standing at a podium saying he has never heard of anything this horrific, there are others that never get that far. And that is the part of this story that extends past Javeayah Harris specifically and into something that every person watching has a stake in. Because here is what makes a case like this matter beyond its specifics. It is not an extreme outlier on a scale that is otherwise reassuring. It is an extreme point on a continuum that includes smaller decisions made in smaller moments by people who also ultimately chose concealment over the harder thing. Harm, then silence, then cover. The specific form changes. The underlying sequence does not. And the question that this case forces into the open is the one those people never ask themselves. At what point does the covering cost more than the truth would have? For Javeayah Harris, the answer to that question came too late. It came by weeks. And now, because this is crimes records and we do not leave cases before covering where they actually stand, here is the complete picture of where this case sits as of the most recent confirmed information. Some of Javeayah's remains have been recovered from Cedar Creek Reservoir in Fairfield County, South Carolina. DNA testing has confirmed they belong to her. It is, according to Sheriff Sawyer and the forensic evidence his office has gathered, unlikely that the entirety of her remains will ever be recovered, given the method used to dispose of them. The search that consumed 5,000 acres, hundreds of officers, multiple agencies, 5 days of intensive effort, and an entire community's sustained prayers has ended, not with the outcome anyone hoped for, but with the only truth that was still available to find. Both Javeayah Harris and Javeayah Harris are in custody without bond at the Aiken County Detention Center. Between them, they now face at minimum 3 charges each. The primary charge under South Carolina Code Section 16385, destruction and desecration of human remains under South Carolina Code Section 1617-600, and for Javeayah Harris specifically, the additional charge of filing a false police report. The sheriff's office has indicated that additional charges may still be possible as the investigation continues. The evidence collected from the home on Hillsborough Street, the deteriorated cloth, the shoe, the 4 hours of meticulous sifting and photographing, now sits inside a case file that a prosecutor from the Second Circuit Solicitor's Office will eventually carry into a courtroom. Whatever that evidence says in its complete form, whatever the confessions contain in their full and unedited detail, whatever the DNA analysis adds, beyond what has been publicly confirmed, all of it will be tested in front of a jury in a proceeding that, given the complexity of the case and the volume of forensic work still being processed, could be more than a year away. Javeayah's extended family, the grandparents and aunts and cousins who had nothing to do with any of this and who are now left holding a grief that has no adequate language for it, are being asked to wait for a trial, for a verdict, for the kind of justice a courtroom can deliver, which is real and which matters and which is also permanently and irrevocably incomplete. Because no verdict returns a 4-year-old who loved Minnie Mouse. No sentencing hearing gives back the child who chased chickens in the yard and said yes ma'am to strangers and asked to stay outside until it got dark. The September 18th court date is a beginning, not a resolution. What the law says it is owed to Javeayah Harris will eventually be said, but it will be said carefully, procedurally, across however many months it takes. And the community in pink is going to be there for all of it. Before this closes, there is one more thing worth returning to. Because the transcript that covered this press conference said something that deserves to be repeated here, in a space where it can land fully. There was a moment during the press conference, a moment that did not make every headline, where Sheriff Sawyer acknowledged that he had very harsh words he would like to say. And he stopped. He chose not to say them. Not because he does not have them, but because this press conference was for the community, for Javeayah's extended family, for the officers in pink standing behind him. He chose to spend his words on them instead. That restraint, in the middle of the most publicly difficult moment of what is already one of the most difficult cases in Aiken County's history, is the kind of thing that does not get enough attention. A sheriff who could have said anything at that microphone, who had the platform and arguably the moral authority to say whatever he felt, chose instead to protect the integrity of the case, to honor the people in that room, and to let the facts speak for themselves. The facts do speak for themselves. They have been speaking since June 30th. And what they say about what happened to Javeayah Harris, what was done to her, what was attempted afterward, and what failed in the end to conceal her, is already one of the most consequential legal and human stories in recent South Carolina history. She was found. She is not forgotten. And the work is not finished. There are cases that change something in the people who work them. You can see it in the room, in the pink ribbons, in the way a sheriff's voice keeps catching while he reads from a prepared statement, in the way the divers kept going back into the water for hours and hours and hours. These people found her, and the investigators, prosecutors, and community members who have been carrying this case since July 1st will continue carrying it through every court date, every legal filing, every procedural step between now and the day a jury delivers its verdict. Rest easy, they found you, and they are not done. If this case has stayed with you the way it has stayed with everyone who has followed it, do not walk away from it. Subscribe to Crimes Records right now and turn on notifications so you do not miss a single update as this case moves through the courts. Every development, the September 18th status hearing, the trial proceedings, the sentencing, this channel will be here covering all of it with the same depth and care it deserves. Like this video if it reached you. Share it if you think someone else needs to hear this story told fully and honestly. The community in pink has been showing up every day. This is how we show up. See you in the next one.